December 1871. A rented room in Pimlico. The Railway King is dying. Kept, these 5 years, on a subscription of £1,000, raised in 3 weeks. Charity for one old man. This is how kings are buried. Every documentary ends with the crash of 1849. What the record shows is stranger. The 10 years after, when a proven fraudster kept his seat in Parliament, and Parliament kept him out of prison. Most of it is on the record. Few read it. George Hudson was born on the 10th of March, 1800, at Howsham, in the East Riding of Yorkshire, a farmer's son. At 15, he was sent to York, to a draper's counter, a farm at Howsham, a draper's counter in York, a legacy of £30,000. The legacy came in 1827 from a great-uncle, Matthew Bottrell. £30,000, close to £3 million in today's money. Late in life, Hudson is said to have reflected that it was the very worst thing that could have happened to him, because it let him into the railways. The railways were new, the rules were newer, and York wanted a railway of its own. Hudson had spent the legacy well, by the standards of the age. Shares, standing, a place in York's Tory circles. Money in York in the 1830s did not simply sit, it introduced itself. It bought a man committee seats and dinners and the habit of being listened to. In 1836, Hudson became chairman of the York and North Midland Railway. He was 36 years old, and he had found the one machine that Victorian Britain wanted more than it wanted to understand. Because a railway in 1836 was not a business. It was a promise, drawn on a map, sold by the sheet, and paid for by people who had never seen a locomotive. The chairmanships stacked. December 1841, the Newcastle and Darlington Junction. The same month, the York, Newcastle and Berwick. 1843, the Leeds and Bradford. May 1844, the Midland. By the mid-1840s, one man chaired the Midland, the York and North Midland, the York, Newcastle and Berwick, the Eastern Counties, and the Leeds and Bradford. The newspapers had a name for him by then. The Railway King. In 1845, Sunderland elected him to Parliament. In York, a Quaker named Joseph Rowntree defended him. The first dividends were generous, and they were paid, and men like Rowntree said so publicly. Behind that trust stood thousands of smallholders, clerks, shopkeepers, widows. They had put their savings into railway scrip because a man of substance stood at the head of the table, and the table was his. All of it. The traffic reports came to him. The dividend recommendations came from him. The share prices followed him. Where the money went next, almost no one asked. The York and North Midland paid its holders 10% a year. Where the 10% came from, that question would take 13 years to be asked out loud. The country had gone railway mad, and Parliament went with it. 1844. 240 railway bills laid before the House. More than 2 for every day the House sat. 1845. 2,800 miles of new line approved in 7 months, as much as the previous 20 years combined. 1846. 263 separate railway acts, 9,500 miles, authorized in a single year. It reached everywhere. Scrip, the paper promise of shares not yet paid for, changed hands in coffee houses, in market towns, at church doors. A signature on a subscription list, and a family's savings were riding on a pencil stroke through somebody's field. Ordinary investors would lose significant parts of their savings before it was over. Money poured in from every county. And at the center of the pour stood the chairman of 5 companies, recommending his own dividends. Here is how the machine worked. A railway earns money from traffic. Passengers, coal, freight. That is profit. And profit pays the dividend. Hudson's companies paid dividends the traffic could not support. The money came instead from capital, from the funds shareholders had subscribed to build the lines. New investment came in at the front, Dividends went out at the back. The books called it income, called it what it was, a dividend machine. Other lines paid dividends they had not earned, carelessly, in imitation. Hudson ran his as a system, quietly, methodically, without fanfare. Traffic figures were inflated, and shares were moved between his own companies at prices he set himself. He set the traffic figures. He set the dividend. He set the price of his own shares. It is tempting to ask where the regulators were. The answer is on the record. In 1844, William Gladstone, at the Board of Trade, proposed tighter control of the railways. Parliament declined. And here the benches deserve a second look. In 1845, more than 125 members of Parliament held railway directorships. The men who would have voted for regulation were, in remarkable numbers, the men regulation would have reached. Not everyone was charmed. Charles Dickens, in a private letter, never printed in his lifetime, confessed himself disposed to throw up his head and howl whenever Mr. Hudson was mentioned. The howling stayed private. The dividends stayed public. The machine ran on. By 1846, the railway king controlled companies worth millions, sat in Parliament, and dined where the laws were written. And underneath all of it, one arrangement. The dividends were real. The profits were not. At the end of 1848, the machine cut a payment. What happened next took 3 meetings and 13 days. At the close of 1848, the York and North Midland cut its dividend from 10% to 6%. For a machine built on confidence, a cut was a confession. The 15th of February, 1849. At the Midland, shareholders called for an inquiry. Hudson threatened resignation, and the call collapsed. The 20th of February. At the York, Newcastle, and Berwick, 2 shareholders, Horatio Love and Robert Prance, stood up with the share ledgers. Hudson had sold shares to his own company at prices set well above the market. This time, the inquiry was approved. The 28th of February. At the Eastern Counties, with Hudson absent, his own deputy laid the blame at his door. 3 meetings, 13 days, 13 years of the machine, ending at the pace of a committee minute. In April, the Prance report set it out in committee prose. Shares wrongly valued, dividends drawn from capital. Hudson was ordered to repay £30,000. £30,000. The exact size of Matthew Bottrell's legacy. The machine had returned him, precisely, to the beginning. In May, he resigned the chair of the York and North Midland. The settlements that followed reached £212,000. What he had taken in total was put somewhere between 600,000 and £750,000, between 75 and 95 million in today's money. The exact figure was never settled. In York, Joseph Rowntree read the findings and turned. The man who had defended the first dividends now condemned them. Whether he had always doubted or was converted by the evidence, the record does not say. And now the part the documentaries skip. George Hudson remained a Member of Parliament for 10 more years. Not quietly, not in disgrace-stricken retirement. He kept the seat for Sunderland, through the exposure, through the settlements, through the newspapers. 10 years. You would have kept the seat too. Everyone who could have removed him owned the same shares. The law of the day protected sitting members from arrest for debt, while Parliament was in session. So the pattern set itself. In session, Hudson sat in Westminster, untouchable, voting on the business of the nation. In recess, he crossed the Channel to Boulogne, out of reach of English bailiffs, and waited for the House to reconvene. Session by session, year by year, a decade. Consider what that required. Not one exemption, granted once, but a standing arrangement, renewed every session, visible to every member who shared the benches with him. Nobody moved to change it. In 1859, Sunderland finally voted him out. The portcullis lifted. Exile began in earnest. 6 years in Boulogne, hiding from his creditors. Boulogne was not glamorous. A resort town full of Englishmen who could not afford to be in England. the Railway King among them, older each year, poorer each year, waiting for letters. In October 1865, the industrialist Sir George Eliot paid Hudson's debts and freed him from debtor's prison. In 1866, Hugh Taylor, Member of Parliament, opened a subscription fund. £1,000 raised in 3 weeks, about £125,000 in today's money, placed in a trust the creditors could not touch. A legal instrument drawn by careful men so that a ruined fraudster could keep an income his victims could not attach. Parliament abolished imprisonment for debt in 1870. On the 9th of December 1871, visiting York, Hudson fell ill. He was carried back to London and died on the 14th of December at 37 Churton Street, Pimlico. He was 71. He was buried at Scrayingham, beside the countryside where it had all begun. What is established? No trial, no charge, no sentence. The Victorian state prosecuted forgers and pickpockets with enthusiasm. For the Railway King, nothing. 10 more years on those benches, and nothing. The reason is not mysterious. In 1845, the men who would have had to move against the railways were, in their hundreds, directors of the railways. He was not protected by the system. He was the system. Remember the number in the subscription book? £1,000. From the men who had read the Prance report. Joseph Rowntree had read it too. His verdict did not change. The machine was never dismantled. It was renamed. Dividends from capital. Traffic figures set at the top. A chairman marking the price of his own shares. Parliament wrote the railway laws. The railways wrote Parliament. £1,000 in 3 weeks. Not charity. A pension from the club he built. Kings are not buried. They are kept. Read the footnote. 140 years later, a man on a yacht ran the same machine, with pensions instead of dividends. That story is already here. Robert Maxwell.